In this episode of the Songwriter Theory Podcast, we are going to talk about writing hooks. We are going to talk about lyric writing. We're going to talk about song sections and song structure, and we'll talk songwriting philosophy, all in this brand new version of the Songwriter Theory Podcast. Let's talk about it. Hello, friend. Welcome to another episode of the Songwriter Theory Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Joseph Vidala. Honored that you would take some time out of your busy day and week to talk songwriting with me. Welcome again to this brand new version of the Songwriter Theory Podcast. We'll call this season 2, I suppose, which makes season 1, 5 years, 6 years, however long the first one was. But yeah, the season 2, if you will, is going to look a little bit different. If you want to skip this relatively short explanation as to what we're changing, why, sort of the thought behind it, then feel free to, especially if you're on YouTube. Should be very easy with the chapters. You can just skip this chapter. But if you listen to one part of what I'm going to say before we dive into the content, I would highly recommend it be just this first part. Every episode, probably, or at least right now, the idea is that each episode will center around a song, or at least use a specific song as a off-ramp, or as a, I don't know what the right term is here, but essentially we're going to go off of one song for the different concepts that we're going to talk about in the episode. But do not confuse that as it being important that you A, know the song, or B, like the song. If you detest the song that we are utilizing to learn that day, honestly, it doesn't matter. You'll probably hear, 20, 30 seconds of the song total. And for the most part, we're using the song as an example, as an offboard for talking about specific concepts. Like, oh, here's an interesting music theory concept that they use in this song that we can talk about. And whether you hate the song or not is kind of irrelevant. Now, admittedly, early on, probably most of the songs that we cover are going to be songs that I don't hate. But, conceivably, we could do songs that I detest and still, it makes no difference. So comparing it, say, to Rick Beato's What Makes This Song Great, which, is the closest comp that I can think of. His purpose in that is essentially twofold: to get you to maybe respect the musicality, the music theory, the composition, whether you liked the song or not. Maybe you didn't really like the song before, and Rick Beato will help you to appreciate the song. He considers himself largely a music appreciation channel, first and foremost, so that makes sense. And the premise is what makes this song great, right? Which means that the premise is that the song is indeed great. We are not doing any of those things. My goal is not to get you to think, oh, this song is amazing. Some of these songs won't be amazing. I'm not even thinking about whether the song is amazing or not. I'm thinking about, does this song have some interesting things that we can learn from? Which might mean the songs are great, might mean the songs are just okay, they might be average. That's not really the point. The point isn't that you love the song by the end of the episode. The point is not to make an argument that it is a great song or isn't a great song. That is not the point. The point is for us to learn songwriting from songs. And so I just want to give that sort of preface because it's the first episode of this style. And you all know, if you've been listeners for a while, my favorite artist by far is Vertical Horizon. So it felt right that we would start with Vertical Horizon's biggest hit. But another caveat is that I'm not always going to pick the biggest hit from an artist. I believe these first 2 episodes are probably the biggest hits from their respective artists. The third one, I don't even think is close. I think it's like their 7th most popular song. And some of them will be songs maybe you've never heard of. The James Taylor song I'm thinking of covering at some point is one that most people, including James Taylor fans, don't even know exist. But I think it's a pretty great short song. And it might be the one that we end up covering. So again, doesn't matter whether you like the song or not. The point of the episode has nothing to do with that. Whether you hate the song or love the song, the value of the episode probably will stay about the same. which makes it very different in that way than the Rick Beato episodes, where for the most part, you probably would only watch if you're like, yeah, I already love that song, or maybe begrudgingly watch if it's something that you don't really like and you're like, all right, Rick, help me appreciate the song more than I did before. But again, that's coming from Rick Beato's a music appreciation channel, and it's not a podcast, so a little bit different. But here, our goal is to learn about songwriting. We're not trying to appreciate music so much as we are trying to get knowledge about how we can improve our own songs, how we can write our own songs better, with the foundation being a certain song that we're talking about for that episode. If you haven't already, be sure to grab my free cheat sheet, 20 different ways to start writing a song. One of the ways that we talk about starting a song is actually pretty similar to how this song allegedly started that we're talking about today, which we're talking about Everything You Want by Vertical Horizon. For the record, in case that's not obvious from the title of the video and the title of the podcast. So be sure to check that out, songwritertheory.com/free guide. I think a great way to get good variety in our songs and have our songs not all sound the same. A great way to make sure that we don't have writer's block, or at least limit writer's block, is just to change the way that we start our songs. Again, songwritertheory.com/free guide. All right, track one. The first thing we are talking about is what we'll call Hookception. So the intro of this song, to me, is one of the more memorable characteristics of the song. If we were to pick really just two things from the song, I would say it's probably this intro, which has really a lot going on that is pretty interesting. And also, of course, the chorus. The chorus is probably what made it a hit song, and the intro is what makes it instantly recognizable. And the intro is something that is a concept that has been extremely influential to me. I think it's where a lot of songwriters are missing out on things. And it's really this concept of having not one hook, but two different hooks, which, by the way, makes it so that each hook has less pressure to be great. If you have two different hooks that are working together, you can have something really memorable in aggregate, even if the two on their own are not necessarily that memorable. And this is something that very often just isn't utilized enough. Very often there'll just be like the single guitar hook that is really driving the song, if that. And lots of songs don't even have that, which is fine. You can have a song that has no hook at all, essentially, no musical hook, I should say, non-vocal hook. And that can be fine. But I think a missed opportunity that we often have is that we can have more than one hook at the same time that are playing off of each other. So we're going to listen real fast to the intro to this song, which again is Everything You Want by Vertical Horizon. And I want you to listen. The first part is an electric guitar part, which it doesn't sound like it is, but it is. It's an electric guitar part, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then the second part that comes in is an acoustic guitar part. I want you to pay attention to what each of them are doing, and then we are going to break it down. So that's the electric guitar part, and the acoustic guitar comes in right here. So, as you heard, two different hooks, and the vocals haven't even come in yet. There's only two instruments at this point. There might be a little bit of rhythm, something as well. I don't remember, but essentially there's just two instruments, and they're both hooks. And that's before we actually have the vocal come in, which is providing yet another melody. So every single part of this song so far is a melody. We have the electric guitar part, which is going something like this. So that's essentially what the electric guitar part is doing, which in and of itself is fairly simple. It's on the beat, but it's something that is made more interesting by thinking about how to make it interesting at small levels. So for instance, a part of what makes that electric guitar hook really interesting is the dissonance. Most of the hook is built off of this whole step. Right? So we have that dissonance, which is pretty dissonant. It's not as dissonant as a half step, but it's pretty dissonant. And the riff is built off of that. Still that dissonance, right? And then we have this, which is a little less dissonant, and then dissonance, dissonance. So that's one part that makes it interesting, is that dissonance. Dissonance is almost always a hack to make something more interesting. It is simple, but it's got a little memorable melody in there. It's very simple, right? On its own, it's nothing to write home about, but it does have a melody that you can attach to, that you could imagine yourself singing along with or humming. It has a certain very simple, memorable quality to it. And then it's elevated by the sound being different. Most people don't even realize that is an electric guitar. It doesn't sound like an electric guitar. It sounds kind of like a synth, but it doesn't really sound like a synth either. It just sounds like something that only that song has. I mean, I can't think of any song I've ever heard besides that one. And technically, they use that sound a little bit in one song in the follow-up album, but it's really tucked in the background. It's not something that anybody would notice the first 50 listens. But as far as a primary sound in a song, there's no other song I'm aware of that has something quite like that. For the record, it's a guitar with a phase pedal that's turned all the way down, so it's super slow. And I think they also have the forward version and the backwards version going at the same time. So it's got a lot going on. But those little details are what elevates that part to be something that's fairly memorable. When otherwise, it would be simple, it would be fine. But it's those little things that sort of elevate that part all by itself. And then for the acoustic guitar part, a lot of times if you had an electric guitar hook, the temptation would be, okay, I have my hook, so now I'm just going to have a chord progression with the acoustic guitar or with a second guitar. But that's not actually what they do. It is technically a chord progression. A lot of things are technically a chord progression. But as you might have heard, there's very much a built-in riff into that chord progression. So they could have done a plain old chord progression and that would have been fine. But instead, we have another riff built into the acoustic guitar chord progression, which plays something like this. So if you listen to it, you're going to hear something like this. Let's go back to it. So in case you couldn't hear the piano accentuating, it's basically... So there's another riff that's built into the chord progression when we could have just been lazy or not even lazy, just be what normally we would be tempted to do, which is just have a plain old chord progression that doesn't really have any melody that sticks out, any hook-like element of it. But instead, there's that minor difference of if we can add another hook, why not? And this is something that I just think we don't take enough advantage of as songwriters. A phrase I like to use for this is melodies everywhere. Melodies everywhere. If you can somehow add a little melody to as many parts as you can, I mean, there's a limit, but if you can add a little melody to a part, that often can really supercharge that part. Because the fact that we have this second riff really adds to the song, because now we have two kind of interesting hooks, parts, before the vocal even comes in. And the vocal's the star of the show in basically any song. So that gives the listeners more to attach to. And there's also the interesting part. We mentioned how things can be interesting in aggregate as well. There's also the element that regardless of how interesting either of those are on their own, a team is very often not a sum of its parts. When they're put together, they are both elevated even more. So not only do you have not one hook, but two, while also at some point that part is what the vocal sings over, right? So that's the part for the whole verse, really, are those two things. And then we have the vocal. So during a verse, we actually have three different things that we could be listening to and attaching to. That's kind of interesting. We have we have both of those things, and we have the vocal. And they don't distract from the vocal, but it's something else for our ears to attach to and be like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then also within that, because there's so much movement in the music, it's not just static chords. There's just more going on, more little dissonances that are going to happen based on where in each of the riffs each part is, right? One part might be going while the other one's going, and then the other part might be going while the other one's going, or whatever the matchup is. And that helps to make songs so much more interesting. And it doesn't have to be a hard thing to do either. So let's get a little practical about this. So how can we go about doing this and thinking about this? Let's talk about how I think about it first. One is that we can make our music much more interesting in aggregate by having multiple simple parts work together. You can make a chord progression more interesting by simply thinking melodically and thinking about, okay, instead of just C major to F major, let's think about how to build a melody into that. Or instead of just having this really basic electric guitar part all on its own, what if we have another, maybe still very basic bass line that goes with it, that's not just outlining the chords? Or maybe have a more complex part going along with it that makes it so that, yeah, we have this one simple part, but then it combines with this little more complex part, and together it creates something much more interesting. And again, melodies everywhere. Changing your mindset to be, hey, how can I get a melody into this chord progression? How can I get a little melody into this guitar part that I'm writing? Because melodies, by definition, are, essentially the main part of a song that, we would listen to. It's the melody of the song, right? But thinking of it in terms of just a melody, meaning, an individual part that you could hum and that is sort of singable, if you will, which is not an exact definition, but essentially a melody is any sort of melodic part you can make out. So going back to the acoustic guitar part, it is chords, but chords played in a way that you can pick out this melody. So it's essentially an acoustic guitar chord progression with a built-in bass line is another way that you could see it. Bass line is going to be fairly melodic in nature. So, and then another thing is sound. So often people don't even think to play with the actual sound character itself. I think because of the dissonance, the first electric guitar part would be fairly memorable regardless, because it's so much built around this whole step. Right? That's a nice little dissonance there. So I think it probably would be memorable regardless. But it's taken way over the top by the fact that they got creative about how to make that sound with the phase pedal, and it almost has a synthy nature. And I think they play it forwards and then have the reversed version on top of it at the same time, which helps to really soften, I guess, the guitar peaks so that it's hard to tell that it's a guitar. And just doing something like that with one part in your song, thinking a little bit more about, hey, what kind of sound can I get from my guitar? Or can I make my piano part sound really different by, maybe it's a certain synth sound, or maybe even taking something like you have a guitar part and then you add a synth part to it and then sort of combine them together so that the synth essentially accentuates the guitar part. There's so many different ways to think through this sort of thing. It's essentially sound design like they have in movies, designing what a TIE fighter sounds like, or Hans Zimmer did a lot of that for Dune to get a lot of the different sound effects. We can do that with our music too. And I think that's something that we often don't do as much as we should. So last note on this part is it's something worth thinking about, that it doesn't, this is the sort of thing that I think people think is complicated. And it can be if you try to break down, okay, what chord do I have going on here? And then what's going to combine with that well for a second part? That's not always complicated, but sometimes it is, because sometimes the chord that's kind of going on is vague and unclear. And sometimes it's just faster to start with, okay, we wrote this, what we have so far, in what technically would be E flat minor, I suppose, because it's essentially E minor, but the way they tune the guitars in vertical horizon is half step down. So it would become E flat minor, or G flat major, but it's minor. So E flat minor. And so the first riff is an E flat minor. So we know the second riff should essentially be two things. Most of the time, you want to separate the pitch range so that they aren't conflicting too much with each other. Anytime you have notes separated, this is actually kind of dissonant, but you wouldn't know because they're so far apart. You do know that doesn't sound that dissonant. This does. Same notes. But because they're closer together, you can actually hear the dissonance. So one hack, if you will, when you're doing this, to be able to more easily write two different riffs that go together without overly obsessing with the theory of it, is you do have to understand the theory of what key am I in. So we start with that. If you're in C major, both parts should be in C major, and then separate where the two riffs are happening, right? So if you have a bass line and an acoustic guitar part, that's naturally going to have separation because the bass is just lower. If you're doing everything on a keyboard, choose different octaves. Think about even how I was playing it. I was playing it, I believe, in the same pitch ranges as the parts in the song. So one part really was up here, and the other one was more than an octave below, or an octave below, started an octave below. It was something like that. Now, maybe it doesn't have quite that much separation, although I think that was right. But that helps. If the riff was, and the other part was, that would create more of a conflict. So separate out the pitch range when you're writing each part. And then I talk a lot about how, man, it makes songwriting so much easier if you just record your first part and then, sing the second part. So for instance, when you're writing a song, let's say you come up with a piano riff or something, then the easiest way to write a vocal melody is to record that, even if it's just with your phone, and listen back. And as you're listening back to it, you just improvise, because then you don't have to think about playing the riff you just wrote. You don't have to think about anything except for, does this sound right as I sing along? So in the same way that you would write a melody to a chord progression you've written, or to a piano riff you've written, or to a bass line you've written, we can do the same thing with hooks. So you record your first hook, just that over and over again, right? You take that hook and loop it over and over again, and then you try improvising something else. And what you're going to do is listen along and you say, okay, this part sounds good. And then let's say the first time what Matt Scannell tried to do was something like, and that was like, ooh, that didn't fit with this other riff. Something felt wrong. Okay, let's try changing just that last note. Oh, okay, that one sounded good. That's what we're listening for. It's the same thing as when we write a melody on top of a riff or on top of a chord progression. Same exact idea. But instead of going straight to the melody, we are layering hooks. So separate out the pitch range, record the first part, even if it's just on your phone, you playing it over and over and over. It doesn't have to be perfect tempo or anything like that. It's just so you can basically hit play and listen for 3 to 10 minutes straight of the same riff over and over again, and improvise over that riff with the second riff, the new riff, until you come up with something that works. And I'm not saying like, oh, within 5 minutes you'll have it. No, sometimes it takes a lot more work than that. Sometimes the first 4 riffs you come up with that do go along with that first riff are not they're going to suck, and you're going to be like, let's try a different one. But that essentially is a great way to make a song more interesting. Melodies everywhere through Hookception. All right, on to track 2. Second thing we're going to talk about is the lyrics. So I think whenever talking about the lyrics, an important thing to look at is the overall theme of the song. Very often we can find the theme of the song by looking at the chorus. So this song has 2 different versions of the chorus. We have the third person version, which we have for most of the song, and then we have the first person version, which we have at the end of the song. I'm sorry, the direct address version that is at the end of the song. So at the beginning of the song, it's he's everything you want, he's everything you need. And at the end, it's I am everything you want, I am everything you need. So we'll just go off of the third person version for now, as the distinction isn't super important for what we're talking about. So the chorus says, he's everything you want, he's everything you need, he's everything inside of you that you wish you could be. He says all the right things at exactly the right time, but he means nothing to you and you don't know why. So what's the song about? The song is essentially the ultimate friend zone anthem, I would say. But it's essentially this guy looking at this woman saying, you are looking for love in all these different places. You're looking for all these different things, but I'm right here and I have all those things. I am all the things you say that you want. I am all the things that you seem to need. But I mean nothing to you, and I don't know why, right? I check all the boxes, and yet I'm in the friend zone. That's essentially what this song is about. And so it's important to understand that when trying to analyze the rest of the lyrics. So very often you want to kind of start with the chorus, if you can, when diving into the lyrics. And the part of the lyrics that I thought we should sort of narrow in on and had a concept that I thought was worth talking about is the bridge. So the bridge says, but you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for, and you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. Let's play it real fast. You'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. Out of the island. Goes into the third verse. So one thing worth pointing out here, I think, is the chorus. You may or may not have noticed that it essentially is 2 groups of 4 lines each. He's everything you want, he's everything you need, he's everything inside of you that you wish you could be. Thought 1. He says all the right things at exactly the right time, but he means nothing to you and you don't know why. So, part 2. So 4 lines each. The bridge is actually, again, it's 2 pieces. Very often things are in twos in songs. But it's 2 sets of 3 lines this time. But you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. So we have 2 sets of 3 lines this time in the bridge. And this is something that I think we don't look at enough in songs, but a subtle, extremely subtle even. Most people don't notice it, never have even thought about it. Most people who aren't musicians don't really even know what a line in a song is. They've never even really thought about it. But a great way to add a little bit of variety to make your song not all sound the same is simply changing up the structure, how you structure your section. The chorus and the verses are in essentially sets of 4 lines. And the bridge changes it up by being groups of 3 lines. And then meter-wise, for what it's worth, we have AAB, AAB. But you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. That's the same meter. But you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. Right, so it changes for that third one. And you'll be just fine with all of your time, AA, same meter. It's only what you're waiting for. So we have two groups of three lines, AAB, AAB, which is very different than what we had in the chorus. Now, of course, the melody is also different, which is extremely important, and the lyrics are different. But sometimes just changing the structure is a great way to help have one section stand out from another. Another thing in this bridge lyric that I think is worth looking at is the rhyming. And that's because I often like to talk about how people overvalue rhyming and don't realize how many songs that they love and how many songs they listen to, don't religiously follow a rhyme scheme, break the rhyme scheme, don't rhyme at all. And the bridge is a good example of this, but you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. No rhyme. Let's look at the second group. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. Okay, there's a rhyme. It's only what you're waiting for. So if we were to look at the two sets of AAB, AAB, the first AA doesn't rhyme, and the second AA does rhyme. I've listened to this song probably 1,000 times. I've never noticed that. I've never cared, and I still don't care. I realized it when doing this episode. And for that matter, the chorus of this song, which is probably what made it a huge hit back in 2000, 1999. He's everything you want. He's everything you need. He's everything inside of you that you wish you could be. Huge stretch. You could say be and need have, it's a sort of a family rhyme stretch. He says all the right things at exactly the right time, but he means nothing to you and you don't know why. There's almost no rhyming in that chorus. And it's one of the most rhymey, memorable, simple choruses I've ever heard. I mean, I think that's why it's a big hit song, is that the chorus has so many elements that make it easy to memorize, easy to remember, easy to sing along with. It's not super high. Has a lot going for it. So rhyming is, you could just not rhyme. It's fine. It's fine. It's much more important to say exactly what you want to say. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. That's great as is, right? It doesn't feel like that rhyme is forced. In fact, there's wordplay going on in there, which is something else that I think we should talk about. And actually what made me choose this section rather than the chorus, which would be the easy choice to talk about. So the context so far in the song is essentially, there's this girl, she's got all these, not literally, but metaphorically, scratches, scraped skin knees, to borrow from a line in the first verse, and skid marks, right? So she's been through a lot, and she's, looking for maybe someone to save her. It might be, a little overdone perhaps, or just, somebody that will love her for who she is, whatever. And it's covered at this point. By the time we get to the bridge, we've had the first and second verse, and we've had the chorus a couple of times. So it's covered that, hey, this guy seems to be all of the things that you say you want and need, and yet you're not interested, right? So she's doing nothing about the fact that hey, the solution might be right here in front of you. Which leads us to, but you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. So there's wordplay in here. There's sarcasm in here. There's bitterness in here, which if there's one thing that I just think Vertical Horizon is just elite at, it's that exactitude of sadness, bitterness. There's always a bite to it, no matter how sad the song is. Just another example from another Vertical Horizon song is the song Best I Ever Had, which on the surface is just super sad, mopey, oh, you were the best I ever had. But even taking the first line of the chorus, but it's not so bad. You're just the best I ever had. Even that is dripping with some bitterness, right? Oh, it's not so bad. You're just the best I ever had. That's the power of changing the wording or how we word things. more attention to the specificity of how we word things, there's a whole different concept, idea that comes to mind when it's, if I just said, "Oh, you're the best I ever had," that's, whatever, who cares? But it's not so bad. You're just the best I ever had. That is way more interesting just by how it is worded. And going back to this song, but you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. So a little bit of wordplay there, right? You'll just sit tight, which means, you'll do nothing. You'll sit tight and watch it unwind, right? So the inverse of sitting tight, right? Something being tight is it unwinds. It all comes apart. Is sort of the opposite of something sitting tight. And by nature of sitting tight, you're going to watch other things unwind. So there's a little bit of wordplay, sort of two opposite things. You're going to get unwinding, ironically, by sitting tight, not by you unwinding. By you sitting tight, you're getting everything around you to unwind. And then the second part, and you'll be just fine with all of your time. So you have all this time, you'll be just fine. It doesn't really matter, which probably is sarcasm, right? That the way it's sung and everything sort of indicates this level of kind of bitterness and sarcasm. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. So again, a little bit of wordplay. You'll be just fine with all of your time. You can take your sweet time. It's only what you're waiting for. So again, talking about time, really hitting on that concept of time with a little bit of extra wordplay. So it's only what you're asking for, and it's only what you're waiting for, is again, combined with how it's sung, it comes across with this pretty bitter sadness. It's not just, "Oh, woe is me. I'm everything you want. I'm everything you need. And yet you don't want me, and I don't know why." Right? I mean nothing to you, and you don't know why, if we want to go exact on the lyrics. But it's only what you're at, but you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. Just the little nuances of how it's worded completely changes the tone and really helps to accentuate the bitterness and the sarcasm. Even if we just had it be, "And you'll be just fine with all of your time, it's what you're waiting for," versus, "And you'll be just fine with all of your time, it's only what you're waiting for." That "it's only" somehow changes the tone of the whole thing. It's very similar to how I've talked about even "I love you," "I love you," and "I love you." Just changing the meter of the sentence actually changes the meaning. But don't underestimate the little implications that you can add just by adding a little word like "only." It's only what you're waiting for. You'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. But you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. So be sure in your songwriting and in your lyric writing, man, you would be surprised at how big of a difference little adjustments can make. And on to track 3, we are going to talk about song sections and song structure. So when we think of the default song structure, probably in most of our minds, if not all of our minds, is verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. And then most of the alterations to that, we might be thinking of things like pre-choruses. So we would have verse, pre-chorus, chorus, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, and then bridge, chorus. Or we might think about post-choruses. And most often, if you have a post-chorus, usually you have a pre-chorus as well. It doesn't have to be that way, but it seems to happen fairly often that way. So then you would have verse, pre-chorus, chorus, and very often you save the post-chorus for the second chorus. So we'd go back to verse, this time verse 2, pre-chorus, chorus, post-chorus, and then sometimes the post-chorus just goes back to the chorus, and then that goes back to the post-chorus. Or sometimes, again, you'll have a bridge, and then a chorus and a post-chorus again to finish out the song. But something that is very subtle and different and really isn't an uncommon thing to do. But I think as songwriters, sometimes people just don't think about it as much as you would think, is having a third verse that happens after the bridge. And this is something that Vertical Horizon does, I think, more often than not, especially with their earlier albums. And this can be a great way to change how we develop out our story. So if you take the chorus out for a second and just look at the song structure without the chorus, that's usually a good way to break down how the story is being told, because the story is usually something that is very theme driven. In this case, it's not really adding to the story, right? We're talking about, he, we'll start with he. That's what most of the choruses are. He's everything you want. He's everything you need. He's everything inside of you that you wish you could be. He says all the right things at exactly the right time, but he means nothing to you, and you don't know why. So that's covering that main theme. It's not really a story element. The story is contained largely in the verses and the bridge. So with your average song structure, and you take out the chorus, you're left with essentially verse, verse, bridge. So that gives you sort of a 3-act structure. You have your first act, whatever happens first. Then you have your second verse, which is maybe what happens next. And of course, your story doesn't have to be structured that way in a song. Sometimes you start with the present, and then the second verse, you go to the past to figure out how did we get here. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. But you have 3 parts to your story, and the climax of your story is usually going to be in your bridge, because your bridge is going to be a huge musical change up. It's usually higher energy than your verses are going to be. If you think about the energy in your song, on average, chorus is going to be highest energy 99 times out of 100, or hopefully at least 90 times out of 100. The chorus should be the musical highlight of your song. And then the bridge is very often the second most compared to the verse, which is usually going to be the lowest energy of the main song sections. So thinking of it that way, it makes sense that the climax of a story is usually towards the end of the story. And also, the climax is, when you think of the climax musically, that's going to be the chorus. Climax is the biggest part. So the biggest climax of your song musically that is not your chorus is the bridge. And the bridge is the last of the song sections you would have with verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, that is actually story driven or not just about the theme. And of course, there are exceptions to this. It's not always going to be this way, but very often the bridge and verses are kind of working together more on the story side. When you add that third verse after the bridge, this allows you to have a different 3-act structure, or a different way of looking at the 3-act structure, if you are going to have a sort of 3-act structure type story unfold. This gives you the opportunity to have the climax of the story in the bridge, and then to have either an epilogue or the conclusion of the story in a verse that comes after it. So if you think of, 3-act structure and how plots tend to develop, there is sort of this, inciting incident, and then the rising action, which would be the second verse in this case, and then the climax, and then the conclusion. And the climax and the conclusion are both in the third act. So before, the bridge would have had to handle essentially the entire third act of our song. We have to have both the climax of the story, and we also have to conclude the story. But now, in this sort of song structure that we have in Everything You Want, and in many other songs that we can use, is one where we can separate that third act out and let the bridge just concentrate on being the climax of the story, and then conclude the story or have an epilogue to the end of the story in that third verse. So let's look at how it develops in Everything You Want. We're just going to read through the lyrics, taking out the chorus, because again, taking out the chorus is often a very good way to look sort of just at the story level of a song. So the first verse, which is a doubly long verse, so you could see it as the first verse is essentially really verse 1 and verse 2, but really it's just a twice as long first verse. Somewhere they're speaking, it's already coming in. Oh, and it's rising at the back of your mind. You never could get it unless you were fed it. Now you're here and you don't know why. But under skin knees and the skid marks, past the places where you used to learn, you howl and listen and wait for the echoes of angels who won't return. So we could spend an hour just trying to analyze that. But I think at a very high level, essentially, we're covering this person is sort of, waking up and they're in a rough place. They have, the skid marks and they have skin knees and, there's howling going on and you're listening and waiting for the echoes of angels who won't return. So you're crying out to the ether and nothing is coming back. There's no call back. So essentially the girl that this is talking to is in a rough place, right? Super high level, but that's the first verse, being in a rough place. Verse 2, you're waiting for someone to put you together. You're waiting for someone to push you away. There's always another wound to discover. There's always something more you wish he'd say. So now we moved on to, okay, here's what you're looking for. You're waiting for someone to put you together. And yet, in tension with you're waiting for someone to push you away. And then there's always another wound to discover. So, you could keep obsessing over these wounds that you already have, the skin knees and the skid marks and you shouting out into the ether and the echoes of angels that don't return. So we could keep obsessing over this traumatic past or negative past experiences. And there's always something more you wish he'd say. So we've already had the chorus talking about everything you want, but there's that element of, even though that person's perfect in quotation marks, there's always something more. You just always want something a little bit more. So this is, not super story driven, but essentially seeing this sort of as a 3-act structure, that's where really the rising action is starting to happen. We have the initial setup, which is someone who has all this bad stuff that's happened to them. They're in a rough place. There's nobody there for them, or at least none of the people that used to be there for them theoretically are there for them. You howl and listen and wait for the echoes of angels who won't return in that first verse. And then the second verse, we're really setting up this, and now you're waiting for something that's already here, right? Because there's always something more you wish he'd say. So it's really getting into the meat of this. I'm everything you want. I'm everything you need. Then we have the bridge, which is essentially the climax of this very mini story we have. But you'll just sit tight and watch it unwind. It's only what you're asking for. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. So it's sort of this bitter, desperate cry of like, just what are you waiting for? I'm everything you want. We already covered that part. I'm everything you need. And you're just waiting and you're looking for love everywhere but where it already is. I already love you and you refuse to accept that, even though I seem to be everything you want and everything you need. But you're just going to sit tight and watch it all unwind. It's what you're asking for. That's what you seem to want based on your actions, or in this case, inaction, perhaps. And you'll be just fine with all of your time. It's only what you're waiting for. So this is essentially the point in the story where, you could imagine that you're actually saying this to the person, like, what, you're shaking them. Like, what more do you want? I don't understand. How do you not see this? What more can I do? But it's not the conclusion to the story, right? And certainly the song could just go back into the chorus and call it a day. But instead, it goes straight into the third verse, which kind of concludes the story. Out of the island, into the highway, past the places where you might have turned, right? Past the choices you could have made, all these opportunities where you maybe could have chose me. You never did notice, but you still hide away the anger of angels who won't return. So connecting back to that first verse, where in the first verse, it's listen and wait for the echoes of angels who won't return. And now it's You never did notice, but you still hide away the anger of angels who won't return. So sort of concluding the song with the idea that it's over. You're just really not going to choose me. And of course, this is right before we get into the last time of he's everything you want. And then finally, I am everything you want. I am everything you need. So this allows us to have this sort of epilogue or this sort of conclusion to the story, really concluding that, nothing's going to change here because she's coming out of the island onto the highway past the places where you might have turned, right? So she's not taking the turns. She's choosing to keep going. And so the third verse gives you this nice opportunity to have a conclusion, which even if you think of a chart, if you've ever seen the chart of how a story develops, the climax is the high point. And then in the third act, it actually, at the very end of the movie or book or whatever has this three-act structure, the excitement, if you will, comes down, right? After you beat the villain, you then conclude the story, right? The end of the first Spider-Man movie isn't like, oh, Green Goblin's gone and now it's all right, the end of the movie. Like, no. Then we got to conclude some stuff. We have Peter Parker saying, sorry, MJ, I can't because I'm a hero. He doesn't say that, but, essentially. And no superhero film ever or any movie just like ends on the climactic fight, right? There's always a conclusion after that's less high energy that sort of wraps up the story element. And when we have a third verse that comes after the bridge, that gives us this opportunity. So essentially, next time you're writing a song, something to consider is, depending on the story you're trying to tell, if you feel like your bridge is trying to do too much story-wise, because you essentially have your entire third act. And of course, when we talk about third acts, there's a song, right? There's like 200 words total. So it's going to be like this, right? There's not that much story going on. There's only so much story you can tell in 200 words. But if you think of it as a super micro story, think about, is my bridge doing too much? Because then maybe it makes sense to have a third verse after the bridge and make it so that the bridge is not handling essentially our entire third act, where it has the job of both concluding the story and being the climax of the story. Instead, you can split it up, have the climax of the story be with the bridge, which will fit well with the music of the bridge, likely. And then the third verse can conclude the story. And that's a great way to go. All right, track 4, The Tale of Two Sections. A part of what I think really makes this song work and be pretty widely appealing, I would say, is that the verse and the chorus are extremely different in nature. And it's not that they don't feel like they belong to the same song necessarily, but if you look at the chorus is extremely poppy in the context of a rock song, a pop rock song, however you want to look at it. But it's got very radio-friendly sensibilities, if you will. The chorus is very simple and singable, and it's low, right? In pitch range for a chorus is actually pretty low. It's very sing-along kind of chorus. It's not something that people would struggle to sing. Even your parents who can't sing or your brother who can't sing or whatever could sing the chorus of that song. It's very simple. The lyrics are very simple. They're about as simple and straightforward as it gets. I mean, he's everything you want. He's everything you need. He's everything inside of you that you wish you could be. He says all the right things at exactly the right time, and he means nothing to you. And he doesn't know why, and you don't know why. Could not get simpler and more straightforward. But if we compare that to the lyrics and the musicality of the verses, it's very different. Just taking the first verse lyrically, somewhere there's speaking. It's already coming in. Oh, and it's rising at the back of your mind. You never could get it unless you were fed it. Now you're here and you don't know why. But under skin, knees, and skid marks, past the places where you used to learn, you howl and listen and wait for the echoes of angels who won't return. That is extremely vague, right? I have ideas as to what all of those different elements mean, but it's one of those things that's open enough to interpretation that depending on, where you are in life, you might interpret it a little bit differently. Every time you listen, you might sort of hear a different angle that you could understand it. Who exactly are these angels? What does that represent? What exactly do the skid marks and skin knees represent? That part I think is a little more straightforward. But the verses, lyrically even, are pretty vague and more poetic, if you will. This is more use of imagery. It's not as super straightforward, like, oh, a 3-year-old would understand this. It's something that you can sink your teeth into a little bit more. Whereas the chorus is very simple, right? It's obscuring nothing. It's not vague at all. It's about as not vague as it could possibly get. And then musically, we mentioned how the chorus is something that is, very sort of got pop sensibilities in the sense that, the melody is super simple and super singable. And then we have the verse where we talked about, hey, we got two kind of interesting hooks. We got this electric guitar part that sounds really different from really anything else that I've ever heard. It's one of the more notable parts of that song is that electric guitar riff that just has a totally different sound than anything else. The acoustic guitar part is, it's even that's got an interesting melody built in, which doesn't necessarily make it not pop like, I suppose, but it's kind of got this almost creepy, darker kind of vibe, even kind of like almost half whispers, little grit in there, or a little like whispery grit in there, with even the way that Mascanel sings the song. So the two sections are very, very different. And this to me reminds me of things like movies, say like The Dark Knight. That is the Dark Knight would be a genuinely brilliant movie or really, really good movie that's tackling, deeper themes like the fine line between chaos and order, the important of having principles and restraint and having, lines in the sand and rules or lines in the concrete. I don't know, the rules that you will not bend or break, because one of the themes is how Batman easily could become a Joker-like figure if he were to compromise on principles. The corruptibility of man, and then the dangers of elevating people to hero status in Harvey Dent, right? Harvey Dent is an example of how, even people who think they're good can be made to be, can turn evil given the right circumstances, incentives, etc. Sort of the idea that we all have the capability for great evil within us. And if we believe otherwise, that's incredibly dangerous, because Harvey Dent, the White Knight, turns out even he could be turned by the Joker. So it on the surface is a popcorn flick superhero movie, right? When you think of deep, insightful movies, superhero movies, rightfully, generally, would be one of the last ones that you would think of, because they're a sort of the epitome of a blockbuster movie, Transformers kind of thing, like, oh, pretty explosions and cool one-liners and all that sort of thing. But really, The Dark Knight has a lot more to it than it would seem, which pretty much everybody recognizes, I think. But, on the surface, it sort of masquerades just as a superhero film, but it's actually much more than that. And I think Everything You Want sort of has a similar thing going on, which I think was true of a lot of late 90s, early 2000s music, where there's a lot of songs that it would be easy to write off as, oh, that was like popular and that was on the radio. And it's like, there's actually a lot of interesting things going on in that song. And you just assume because it was on pop radio that it's, poppy and super simple. And, we all have these sort of assumptions maybe built in to what pop music is, even though a lot is exactly what we think it is. And some isn't. Some is better than that. But it seems like Everything You Want to me has always been an actually pretty compelling, interesting song that is masquerading just as a pop song. Because boy, that chorus is poppy. And boy, that chorus is I mean, it's probably the poppiest thing that Verkl Horizon has ever written is the chorus to that song. Maybe the chorus of Send It Up, maybe, but it's towards the top for sure. Singable, easy to remember, catchy in a simple way. But The verses offer the opportunity to get more vague, to get more artistic, and to show a little bit more depth to the song than otherwise there would be. And of course, I think too, we've talked before about very often, a breakup song tends to not be interesting, but a breakup song where you get really specific about some element of it can be interesting, right? So this is interesting because it's actually not a breakup song. It's a friend zone song. And I'm sure there's other friend zone songs that probably came before and I'm sure came after as well. But that's more specific and a little bit more interesting because that's not something we've heard a million times. So when writing songs, something that maybe is worth thinking about is depending on what you have in your chorus. Maybe your chorus is really vague and uses a lot of symbolism. And it's a little hard to figure out what really does he mean. Maybe in your verses, write something that's a little more straightforward, use less symbolism. Or you can do the opposite. If you have a chorus that's super clear cut and uses no symbolism and it just tells it like it is, maybe something you can play with is try being more subtle, nuanced, more vague, and leverage symbolism in the verses. You don't need to have the level of poetic language be the same throughout your song if you want to look at it that way. We could maybe have a discussion what poetic language is really, and I think there's a lot more to it than this. But one of the elements I think is how much you have to think about what something means. And I don't mean that like it's just made up and it's just like, oh, this symbol sounds cool. It has to mean something and be intentional. But I think there's something to be said for, with the verses, say, of this song, there's a lot we could discuss about the nuances of, what are these echoes of angels that keeps being mentioned? The end of verse 1 is echoes of angels who won't return. And then the end of verse 3, which is the last part before it's just the chorus. So bookending the first verse and the last verse. But you never did notice, but you still hide away the anger of angels who won't return. So we have that motif, if you will, of angels who won't return that keeps coming up, right? And you and I might have a different interpretation of that, and they both might be wrong from the standpoint of that's not what Matt Scannell intended. But it's sort of like the top at the end of Inception, right? It gives something to talk about, to sink our teeth into. And then sometimes there are certain things that in order to talk about something at depth, you can't just have, a 60-second video that covers something. Right? Everybody wants everything to be 60 seconds now. But the reality is that some things just are deeper and more nuanced. And sometimes the way to arrive at the truth of a thing, it's easier to actually tell a story that indirectly answers the question than it is to directly answer, directly answer a question. So in songs, think about how you can play one section off of another. Oftentimes I think where songs tend to go wrong is the whole song is just so vague that you're like, nobody could even possibly know what this song is about. The darker the rock music gets, to me, the tendency is that it goes down that road. So much of like death metal kind of stuff is like, these lyrics are totally incoherent. They're just like, the black sun draineth from the sky as the blood. It's just like, it doesn't, I doubt it means anything. And if it does, there's no way somebody could get really any, you can just totally make up the meaning of the song. The whole song, it's vague what it's about. And then if you make everything too easily accessible, there's not as much to dig your teeth into, to discuss, to think about, to dwell on. We could probably spend an hour just thinking about those angels who won't return and what really that means, or different things it could mean and the repercussions of each. Just like the top at the end of Inception, give something to talk about. So I think sometimes the best way might be a little bit of both. Because if it's so vague all the time, people can be suspicious. Does this mean anything at all? And if it's all straightforward, there's a little bit less to talk about. All right, track 5, we are going to conclude with a message from the mailbag or mailbox. Be sure to email Joseph at songwritertheory.com or leave a comment down below. And if it's sufficiently interesting or awesome or really nasty and mean or whatever, we'll be sure to read it and answer any questions that you may have. So this is an email from sort of a little while back from Roy talking about writing music that one loves. So the email says, not only is it more enjoyable to work on, again, he's talking about writing music that one loves, but oftentimes what we love is no longer being written in the same style or approach. In addition, if one really loves a certain kind of style, I think mirroring it also helps to ensure that the song quality is stronger. My example is that because some of my favorite groups no longer exist, when I come up with a better than average melody, I often hear it in that style. For example, I really enjoy power pop. Badfinger is no longer recording, yet some of my songs approximate that style. The way I do it isn't to necessarily try to come up with a Badfinger song, but a lot of times, perhaps you are this way also, is that when I hear a melody in my head, it's often easily identifiable with a certain group. And because much of the music that I listen to is from the 1970s, like the Raspberries and Badfinger and the Beatles before that, I think it's helpful in having a frame of reference of where to go with what I'm hearing. So the central idea that he's putting forward here, which I think is right on the money, is to write music that one loves. And he sort of goes on to make some examples and sort of an argument for why he thinks this is a good idea, or at least why it works for him. And I think this is a great point and worth expounding on. And one of the reasons I thought this was a good episode to read this one is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I chose to open with this song just because I'm like, you know what? I make no secret that Vertical Horizon is my favorite artist. And, screw it. I'm going to do my favorite artist for the first song because I want to, right? I could have done the more strategic approach and do a Taylor Swift song or a Beatles song, because if you want clicks on a songwriting video, all you need to do is put either of those in the title, and it's a massive cheat code to get like way more views. Which is why some songwriting channels that I won't mention, but some are essentially just like they just go back and forth. Beatles, Taylor Swift, Beatles, Taylor Swift, Beatles, Taylor Swift. Oh, and then John Mayer comes up once in a while. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? You could even say it's good strategy. But I don't want to talk about those things, right? I want to, at least at first, with these, I'm going to be more passionate. I'm going to know more. I'm going to just be more excited to talk about this stuff if it's songs that I enjoy. And again, we construct the episodes in a way that whether you like or even know the song is totally irrelevant, right? We're just sort of using it as a jumping off point for learning purposes, right? We're taking one specific thing from different elements of the song. Like, oh, here's a lyric writing thing we can learn. Here's an interesting music writing thing we can learn, or melody writing, or whatever it is. So even this episode is actually what Roy is talking about applied. And, the first time I read this email, I remember thinking that it was 100% right, and that I thought it was something obvious. Right? I thought it was obvious. And then I realized what a fool I am. It's not obvious, because I get tons and tons of comments and emails and even conversations with people, including people who have been successful songwriters. There's this almost obsession with chasing what's popular right now. Oh, everybody's doing 80s sounds right now. Okay, so I have to do it. Or, oh, I got to know what Taylor Swift's done next, because she and, whoever else is in pop is, setting the industry standards. And by she, I mean her producers, right? Like, which is a real thing, right? Producers kind of try to keep one-ing up each other, and I get all that. But what a soul-crushing, terrible way to write songs, in my opinion, for many reasons. One is, if you try to do what everybody else is doing, then you're probably just going to be behind, and be probably a second rate version of somebody else. And that to me is the ultimate. All should want to avoid being a second rate somebody else. This is why I don't think we should obsess so much with like, oh, Beatles. Beatles are my favorite, and everything I do is through the lens of the Beatles. So then you're going to be a second rate Beatles. Who wants that? We can listen to the first rate Beatles. So nobody wants a second rate Beatles. Same with Taylor Swift, right? Like, we don't need every single 15-year-old girl to decide she wants to be Taylor Swift. In fact, we don't want that. We don't want that many Taylor Swifts. I want 0 Taylor Swifts, okay? A lot of people want 0 Taylor Swifts. A lot of people love 1 Taylor Swift. But even a lot of the people who love the 1 Taylor Swift don't want a second, much worse Taylor Swift. And it's not even some, I don't want you to mishear me. I'm not saying nobody could do generally what Taylor Swift does better. I think tons of people can and do what Taylor Swift does better. She's just more popular because popularity it's never been, the best is the most famous. It's just never in history. Like, it's almost never that way. I was talking to my songwriter friend, and we just out of curiosity, I was like, so to me, I'm like, probably all of the greatest songs ever written, nobody's ever heard. It's like, oh yeah, of course. Of course. Right. And this is a guy who's paid lots of money in the 80s to be a professional songwriter. And his immediate response was, of course. Like, this is true. So I'm not saying that you can't, talk about some of the same things Taylor Swift is and do it better. I think you can. But we don't want to be chasing what somebody else is artistically. We want to chase what we like and chase sort of our own artistic identity. And that is going to come through. Our inspirations are going to come through, right? So he talks about how he really likes Badfinger and the Raspberries and mentions the Beatles. So those influences are going to naturally come through because, in this story, Roy is essentially saying that he's chasing writing music that he likes. And at least to me, it doesn't sound like he's saying, I'm trying to write Raspberry songs. He seems to actually go out of his way to say, I don't specifically say like, I want to write a Badfinger like melody or whatever. No, instead it's, I chase a certain sound that I like, or I chase, writing in a tone that I really like. Essentially, I try to write music that I like. And of course, some of my favorite artists are going to come through in that, right? I've never sat down and been like, let's try, maybe never is a strong word. I've never been like, I'm going to try to write a Five for Fighting like song today, or I'm going to write a Breaking Benjamin like song today. No, but like in some of my songs, you will hear that because they are big influences. So that's going to happen. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I think that's a good thing. Every artist ever is some sort of combination of their own ethos, their own artistic identity combined with or augmented by all their different sphere of influence, essentially. So, yes, if you listen exclusively to, hard rock stuff and somebody else listens exclusively to country and you had the same sort of core artistic identity, one of you is going to lean more country and one's going to lean more hard rock because of your influences kind of pull you that way. Totally good, totally fair. So I think the big takeaway here is that Roy is right on the money, and don't be obsessed with chasing what's popular or what you think people will like. We've talked about this before, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but a lot of people chase what they think people like, and nobody knows what people like. We can try, but nobody really knows. Even artists themselves have no idea why their fans like them. Evidence? Almost every artist that has ever sold out, or sometimes artists that like just go really downhill, and everybody who liked their early stuff doesn't really like their stuff anymore. And you're like, what happened to them? And oftentimes, artists bragging about, we feel like this is the best album yet. And I get you always have to say that about the latest album. But a lot of times it's like, no, they really believe it. And they'll even say things like, oh, we know the fans really like, heavy guitars. So we try to go back to heavy guitars, blah, 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 blah. And a lot of times they just miss the point. It's like, yeah, it's not like your fans don't like heavy guitars. It's not like that's not a part of what they like about you. But if you think the core trait that you had that your fans liked was like, oh, I like heavy guitars, bro. Some fans, maybe, but a lot of times, no. There's probably something deeper, something more meaningful that people were attaching themselves to that they really loved about your music. So even artists themselves usually don't know why people like their music. So the idea that we would know, oh, this is what people like about music, in a very specific way, like, oh, I need to make my melody more this. And, oh, the reason people like Taylor Swift is this. Like, we don't know these answers. So my advice is just pursue your own artistic identity and write music that you wish was made, because you're going to be more passionate about it. You're not going to burn out, or at least you're not going to burn out as much. It's going to be more fun. It's not going to crush your soul. It's going to make you an actual artist who's pursuing what you believe to be beautiful, what you believe to be good, what you believe to be nice, pleasant to listen to, or epic, or whatever it is you like in music. That's what's going to excite you. And that's therefore probably what you're going to write best, what you enjoy. So do that. Don't worry about chasing what's popular. Roy is right on the money. All right, friend, that is it for this episode of the new season, the new way of doing the Songwriter Theory podcast. Be sure to let me know what you think, Joseph, at songwritertheory.com. They probably won't all be as long as this one ended up being. We'll continue to tweak it as we go. And if you haven't already, again, be sure to grab my free guide, 20 different ways to start writing a song, songwritertheory.com/free guide. That's a great way to get started with songwriting, especially with the first tip that we were talking about, where it comes to hookception and having one hook and then you have another hook that's layered in with that hook before we even get to the vocal. For things like that, that's the sort of songwriting or song that you're not going to get unless you probably start with the hook. So if we're always writing with chord progressions first, then we're probably just not going to write a song or a part of a song quite like that. So again, thanks for listening. Thank you for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. We'll talk to you in the next one.